Hey everyone, so I'm back. I'm going to probably break up some of my videos so they're not too long, but I do need to cover a lot of material, so I'll try and go as quickly as I can, but sometimes I'll break up the video. So again, you want to print out this worksheet. This worksheet is going to be important for the quiz, but it's also going to be important, again, you're going to compete with your fellow classmates on a March Madness GDP bracket, similar to the college basketball March Madness bracket. So here's the front page of your packet. Again, we already covered in my last video, I covered the whole philosophy about what makes us happy, what's our well-being. And again, this is something I think we all to a degree think about, having a quality of life. So it's not always about money. Money does provide for certain things. If you guys know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it does provide for physiological and basic necessities like shelter, water, and all that. But as you start to accumulate a certain amount of money, economists have actually measured this. Typically, once you get to about $1 million, $2 million, extra money does not provide very much extra happiness, because once you have a car, having 2 cars or 3 cars or 4 cars, you can only drive 1 car at once. Having more clothes doesn't make you more happy because you can only wear 1 pair of clothing at once. So while money is important, there is a point where actually it's called the diminishing utility of money, where it actually does decrease. So like I said with Warren Buffett, having another $1 million or $1 billion doesn't provide a lot of happiness. So I'm going to keep going back to that philosophy of, is GDP a good measure of happiness and economic well-being? All right. Another one I do want to briefly mention is purpose. Adam Smith, again, in his theory of moral sentiments, he talks about people need to have a purpose. So you can have a lot of money, or you could have a job and all that, but I totally agree with purpose. That's why I'm in education. I believe in having something that I enjoy doing, feel like I'm making a positive impact, and having lower stress and having more peace of mind and things of that sort. All right, so let's go ahead and start filling this in. You guys, again, print out the worksheet, fill it in, and then you'll be taking the quiz, and actually you'll need this worksheet to do well in the bracket. So again, here's the 10 principles of economics. We want to go back to that and reference that. This specific principle that we're covering here is, which principle are we covering? It's really principle 8 from the beginning of the semester. A country's standard of living depends on the ability to produce goods and services. All right. So we want to define microeconomics as, again, the firm's allocation of scarce resources. And you should know macroeconomics is about society. So that's why I'm really getting into a society, a lot of philosophical ideas about how can we make us as a society better off. Well, if you remember from chapter 2, we had the PPF, or the production possibility frontier. And remember, the PPF shifted out to the right. Well, as the PPF is shifting out to the right, that's economic growth, and that's what we're trying to measure. That's what we're trying to put an equation to, okay? So how do we measure if we're better off, and can we measure it? Well, some things are difficult to measure. Some things are easier to measure. Something that has a dollar figure is obviously pretty easy to measure. If I can measure if I have more cars or things of that sort. But can I measure if I go to a concert and I enjoy that concert, can I measure the happiness of me going to that concert? All right, so GDP, which I've been referencing, is an acronym for gross domestic product. So you should know, as I say GDP, that's what I'm referencing. Now, I usually have students fill in the circular flow model. I think I gave you guys the circular flow model on your worksheet. But if you remember, the circular flow model was a simple model from chapter 2 that we drew in that kind of measures the economy, households and firms and spending and all that. Now, the problem is, in chapter 2, there was a couple things that weren't included. Now, when households get their income or get their paycheck, what do they do with it? Do they put it on their mattress? No, they obviously go to a bank and they save it. So the diagram down here emits taxes. Obviously, we pay taxes on that money. We obviously deposit that money. We have investments. Another thing that's not included on the circular flow is foreign trade. So when we're doing the circular flow, when we're doing GDP, we have to factor those variables in, because we're trying to measure all economic activity in the U.S. economy. So obviously the government is a big part of economic activity. The financial system and foreign trade are big parts of that we need to consider. All right, so down here, this is really important. Again, this table, a lot of this stuff is in your textbook. Obviously, these videos and these worksheets are trying to make it easier for you guys to learn the material and to try and clarify it and give you guys a deeper understanding of the knowledge. So this is a table that I created that should be a lot easier to help you understand it. The GDP equation is y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, all right? So just like a math problem, each one of those variables is a component. The y is actually GDP, c is consumption, I is investment, g is government spending, and nx is net exports. So when we're doing these GDP problems, that you're going to have a bunch of GDP problems that you're going to have to solve, whenever you're thinking of C or consumption, that's always done by households. Households are the ones that consume goods and services. So anything that a household does, you should be thinking that's consumption. Firms and businesses are the I, or investment. So whenever you think of a firm doing something, typically it's going to be an investment. The only thing that would not be considered an investment that a household does is when a household buys a new home. That's considered an investment. Why, when you buy a new home, is that considered an investment? When you buy a house, what typically happens to the value of the house? Most of you know that it usually goes up, especially over 5 or 10 years. That's called appreciation. So the only thing that most of us buy that actually goes up in value is a home. So that's why that would be an investment. When I buy clothes, or I go to a restaurant, or I buy a car, what happens to the value of those things? They depreciate or go down significantly. So the only thing that we would consider actually for an investment for a household is when you buy a new house. All right, the next part of the equation is government. So government purchases, anything the government does would be the G part of the equation. Foreign trade, again, is when we send something out of a country or into a country. When we send it out, that's an export. Whenever it comes into the country, that's an import. And in red here, the one thing that is not included in the GDP equation is the financial sector. So anything that is a financial transaction would not be included. So to cut to the chase a little bit, GDP is measuring productivity. They're trying to measure how much output we got per quarter or per year. When money's moving around, that typically is not, you're not producing something. The money helps produce something, but you're not physically producing more economic activity. So any type of financial transaction would not be included. All right, this next page is really important. I know some of you are falling asleep at home there. Please stay with me. You need to fill this in, and if you want to be successful at these next problems and do well in the quizzes and this activity I'm going to do, the next page is going to be the qualifying criteria. So the next page is just like if we're playing a game. If you're playing basketball or baseball, what do you need to know? You need to know the rules to the game. So these next things are the rules to calculating GDP. So in your textbook, it has the equation. GDP is the market value of all goods and services. The market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So that definition is how you calculate GDP. So the first one, market value in that equation. All right, so what's included in GDP? All goods measured in the same unit. So if it has a dollar figure, then it's included. So for instance, if I pay someone to clean my house, that would be included because it has I'm paying that person, and that's a financial transaction. If I pay someone to cut my grass, then that would be included in GDP. Now, the same activity, if I cut my grass on my own, that actually is not included because I'm not paying anyone. Even though that's the same economic activity, it's the same thing being done, but I'm actually doing it as opposed to paying someone. Now, that seems kind of bizarre that it's the same thing, but if I don't pay someone, it's not measured in GDP. All right, so housework on my own is not included. Cutting my own grass is not included. Another interesting thing that's not included here is illegal activity. So anything that's done on the black market, none of that activity is actually included towards GDP. So clearly GDP could be understated based on all this illegal activity. This is something that we may get into is legalizing marijuana. Well, when marijuana is illegal, that actually, none of that counts towards GDP. So some of you, that, if anyone wants to legalize marijuana, you could argue that by legalizing marijuana, you would actually increase GDP. And that actually is at 100% correct, because once you legalize it, then you're collecting tax dollars, you're recording the transactions, and that would count towards GDP. All right, so let's go down the list here. So final goods count towards GDP. What is a final good? So let's say GM or Ford is building a car. When the car goes on the car lot and they actually sell the car for, say, $20,000, that would count towards GDP, but only the final transaction. But let's say Ford buys a motor and buys brakes and tires to build that car. Those are what's called intermediate goods. So those are what is going into making the car. Intermediate goods are not counted because you only want to count the final end product that goes to the consumer. All right. So let's give some other examples of this. So let's say you have a car and you go to a mechanic and you need a new motor or a new engine to go into your car. Well, that actually would count because you're the end customer and you're getting that product on a used car. But if something is going into making that final product, it wouldn't count until the final product is sold. Let's give another example. Let's say you're a baker and you're baking a cake. So you go to the supermarket, you buy eggs, flour, and all that, and then you bring it back to your bakery. Does that transaction count when you bought the eggs and flour? No, because you're not the end. That's not the end product. That's an intermediate good. So when you actually bake the cake and you put it on your bakery and you sell the cake, that would count towards GDP. Now, same thing. Let's say I go out to the store and I'm making a cake at my house. Well, if I buy the eggs and the flour, that actually counts because I'm the end user and I'm not going to sell the cake. So the transaction would count in that case. Now you're asking yourself, which I asked the same thing, how the heck do they keep track of this? How do they know whether you're a baker or you're using the products at your home? Somehow they there are GDP economists, and any of you are interested in pursuing this career, there are people that figure out how to quantify all this stuff, and this is how the accounting works out. So there are people that figure this out. All right, both goods and services count. So anything that is a tangible good like a DVD, mountain bike, etc., that would count towards GDP. Also, services count like dry cleaning, concerts, cell phone, etc. All right. It has to be currently produced. So it has to be what usually GDP is measured within the quarter or within the year. So if it's produced now, then it counts. Anything that's used or previously produced, anything like sold on eBay, anything that's used, that was already counted towards GDP in previous quarters or previous years. So that would not count. So let's say a Picasso painting is sold year after year after year. None of that counts because that's not currently produced things. Again, generally the basic idea of GDP is anything that is increasing productivity for the quarter or for the year. All right, another caveat here, again, that's going to be included. And again, all these are the rules for you guys doing well on figuring out all these different economic situations or whether they're included or not included. So it has to be produced within a country's borders. So if the U.S. is producing something within our borders, that counts for United States GDP. Let's say I'm a U.S. citizen and I go to Mexico and I produce something in Mexico. Does that count towards U.S. GDP? No, it does not count towards U.S. GDP because it was produced in Mexico and it only counts towards Mexican GDP. All right. The last one is in a given period of time. So within a given period of time, GDP is measured basically quarterly. So as you know, there's 4 quarters in the year. You have the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter. Just like businesses, public companies have to report quarterly earnings. The GDP is also reported on a quarterly basis. And then obviously there's also yearly GDP as well. So it has to be within that time frame. Anything that's outside that time frame would not count. So if I'm measuring 2020 GDP and it was produced in 2019, then that obviously would not count towards 2020. All right, and the last part of this sheet, again, this sheet would be the most important as far as you guys being successful on some of these problems coming up. So household. So if you're a renter, your rent payments counts towards GDP. if you're a homeowner, they do not count mortgage payments, right? Somehow they do a calculation to figure out rent payments for homeowners. Why is that? Well, every homeowner has a different interest rate, different down payment, different things. So they just use this blanket rent payment estimate to calculate the payments for homeowners. So I don't know if you guys ever saw Zillow. It's a website, and they generally look at the rent payments for a geographical area. All right. So existing home sales do not count. So if people are buying homes that were already built, those would not count. And again, mortgage payments do not count. So investments for a firm, investments are not financial investments. So financial transactions like buying stocks, bonds, savings, etc., none of that counts. Again, those are financial transactions. But an investment for a firm is like capital spending, like physical capital, which we learned earlier in the semester. If they're buying machines, or they're purchasing inventory, or they're building a building, that would all count. And again, as I said earlier, the one thing that counts for a household purchase is when you buy a new home. It's the only thing that a consumer does that counts as an investment, because a new home goes up in value. All right, the last two is government spending. So anything the government does counts for government spending. It doesn't matter whether it's the federal level, the state level, or the local level. So if you're the FBI and you buy a new car for your FBI agents, that would count towards government spending. If you're a state trooper and you buy a vehicle, that counts. If you're a Newtown police, you buy a vehicle, all that counts towards government spending. The other thing that's important here is transfer payments. All right, I know I'm going a little bit long, but please stay with me, pay attention. The other thing here is transfer payments. Transfer payments do not count. What is a transfer payment? Social Security income, so when your grandparents get their Social Security check, that does not count towards GDP. Unemployment insurance does not count. Medicare, if any of you know what Medicare is, that's what you're paying. It's taken out of your paycheck when we turn 65 years old. That covers our health care coverage when we retire. So Medicare payments do not count. And Medicaid is actually health insurance for poor people. That also does not count. All right, and the last one is net exports. So exports minus imports is net export. So that's the only thing that actually could take away from GDP, because if we import a lot of things, obviously that's a negative, and that's the one thing that can subtract from GDP. All right, so here's again, this sheet here is the most important. Again, this is the rules to our game. So you want to, if you have to, rewind this video and make sure this is thoroughly filled out. So when you're completing the quizzes and you're competing, if you want to get 100% on these problems, you're going to need to know what is included in GDP and what is not included in GDP. Thank you for filling all that in. Again, typically building knowledge is the most boring of this activity, but as we're competing on our GDP bracket, hopefully it'll be a little bit more interesting. Good work.